Greetings, folkaroos. It's Haley, coming at you today with the first video of the channel, after the introduction video and the intermediate level Sunday video. And in my opinion, this is probably the most important video I'll ever make. Basic chess fundamentals. These are the things you should know before even playing your first game. So, before we blabber on too much, let's quit that blabbering and head into the video. So this here is the chessboard. This big square consisting of 64 smaller squares with a white square on the bottom right. You know, if you were ever setting up an actual chessboard, just know that there's a bottom square. The bottom right square is white. That is a pretty important thing to know. This is where it all happens. This is where chess is played, where memories are made, where all of the magic of the 64 squares happens right here. It looks rather modest, doesn't it? But as I explain the rules to you, you'll become less modest and hopefully more interesting and motivating. So, let's get started. The first piece I want to talk about, because first, now that I've discussed the board, which square is here, let's talk about how the pieces move. This is really the most basic thing. So, the first piece I want to talk about are the pawns. As I highlight all of the pawns for both sides here, these guys are the pawns. They are the basic troops, the foot soldiers. They are your most numerous piece and your least valuable piece. They have 1 point of value. You don't really need to know what that means at this point, but they have 1 point of value. They move in a straight line. They move rather simply. Like, say, for example, this pawn here moves in a straight line like this. But that's certainly not it. Pawns would be very boring pieces if that was the only thing that happened. They can also, like this one moves the same way, they can also move 2 squares forward, but only if they're on their starting squares. So you remember here at the beginning of the game, all the pawns are here on the second row in front of the pieces. If a pawn is on this second row, it can move forward 1 space like this one, or it can move forward 2 spaces in one go. Yeah. And by the way, an interesting historical piece of information, historical chess tidbit here is this is the reason why pawns can move forward 2 squares in the opening, is that the widely accepted best first move for each side is this and this. E4 and E5. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Moving these 2 pawns 2 squares. And back in the way olden days of chess, the 2 square rule hadn't been implemented, and games would start like this. Both sides would move their pawn and then move their pawn again. So people were like, why don't we just change the rule so that you don't have to waste a move in the opening just moving your pawn there? Like, let's just do it in one go. All right. So anyway, back to this position. Pawns are also, if you know what I mean, a little bit not like the other pieces. They're quirky. And the way that they're quirky is in the way that they capture. So let's just say that this pawn here, like I said, it moved off of its starting square, so it can only go 1 square forward. Let's say this pawn goes here. The enemy pawn doesn't capture forward. It doesn't capture the way it moves. It captures like this. You see, pawns, unlike all of the other pieces on the board, capture in a way differently than they move. Like, pawns move straight, and they capture diagonally forward. They can't capture diagonally backwards because pawns can't move backwards. Pawns can only move forward. Once you move a pawn, you cannot move it back. It is there until you move it up again, and pawns cannot capture the same way they move. All right? I think that's all you need to know about pawns for now, so let's get on to the next piece, which are the bishops. These guys right here. Those are the bishops. The bishops can move in diagonals like this. That is how the bishop moves. And due to the fact that they move on diagonals, the bishops for each side cannot change colors. This bishop, for the entire game until it gets captured, will always stay on the white squares. That is why each side is said to have a light squared bishop and a dark squared bishop. You see, black moves their dark squared bishop out, and white has moved their light squared bishop out. This is called the bishop's opening boy variation, but you don't need to know that. And unlike the pawns, they're not quirky like the pawns. They capture the same way that they move. If a piece is on the diagonal that they can move to, they land on the piece and capture it, removing it from the board. When a piece gets captured in chess, it gets removed from the board permanently. And to do that, you need to land on that piece which your piece can see. So in this case, the bishop sees the light square diagonal, and it sees the pawn here, and it can take the pawn. And an interesting thing is that with every other piece, or with every piece in the game, actually, you can't capture beyond the first piece that piece sees. So you can take this pawn, like I said, but you cannot move past the pawn and take the knight. That's an illegal move. So there we have the bishops. And the next pieces are kind of similar. So next we have the rooks. The rooks work pretty similarly to the bishops, but instead of diagonals, they move in straight lines. The rooks move only in horizontal lines like this. Like you see here, all the possible squares that the rook can go to, just horizontal lines and vertical lines. And like the bishops, the rooks can capture anything that is on those horizontal or vertical lines, but cannot capture past that. And when the piece is captured, it is removed off the board permanently, like so. Remember pawns, the quirky pieces, not like the other pieces, they can take diagonally. All right, now we have talked about the bishops, the rooks, and the pawns. I think it is time we introduce the eldritch horror combination between the rook and the bishop. Her Majesty herself, the girl boss, the queen. The queen is the most powerful piece. And by the way, I forgot to mention the relative values of the pieces, like I did with the pawns. The knights and the bishops, we haven't talked about the knights yet, but I guess I'll just say this. The knights and the bishops are both worth 3 points. The rooks are worth 5 points, because being able to move this way is considered more powerful. You don't need to know why. And the queen is worth a whopping 9 points of value, because the queen can move horizontally, it can move vertically. Again, it can't move on top of your own pieces, and it can move diagonally as well. So the queen is basically a combination between the bishop and the rook, and the same capturing rules apply. It can take a piece that it sees on either that diagonal or horizontal line, but it cannot move past that piece. So, why have I been reiterating that after every single piece? Well, it's because of these last pieces before I talk about the king. The knights. There's a reason I saved these guys for last besides the king, and it's because they're a bit weird. The knights move like this. I know, funky. Like, what did you just watch? I'll break it down. The knights move in an L shape. Either 2 squares up and 1 square over, like this, 2, 1 to either side. Or they can also do 1, 2, or 1, 2. So just picture an L on the board, and any L that you can draw is where the knight can move. Again, a square not occupied by your own pieces. Like the knight could technically move here if the pawn wasn't there. Like let's say here, like you can't go here, but you can go here, 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 and here. Those the L moves. That's how the knight moves. It moves in an L. But another goofy thing about the knights that you probably did notice is that unlike all of the other pieces, they can jump over other pieces. Like no none of the other pieces can move past other pieces at all. But the knights don't care about anything. They're just like, I'm going to that square, so I will go there no matter what is in my way. So here, knight jumps over the pawns, but it can also jump over the enemy pieces. Like, let's say this, 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 which is check, so I have to take. We'll talk about check later. But the knight can also jump over the enemy pawns to take this rook. Knights are really tricky. It takes a while to get used to how they move. So I will understand if it takes a while for you to understand how they move. But just know that they move in an L, either 2, 1, or 1, 2, depending on if you can move to that square, if there's not any of your pieces. And knights can only capture pieces that are on the square they will end up at the end of their move. They don't capture anything that is like in these two intermediary squares. So that is all of the pieces besides the king, and now we'll just talk about the king because the king is the simplest piece in regards to its move set, because it can just move one square. It can move one square in any direction, diagonally, horizontally, unless that square is controlled by another piece. Like, you know how pawns can capture diagonally one square? That would mean that if the king moved here, it would be taken by the pawn, which would lose the game for white because the object of chess is to capture the king. So the king cannot move here because then the pawn would take and the white would lose. So the king can move anywhere that's not controlled by an enemy piece. And ignore this opening. It's called the bomb cloud. I know, it's fun. Kind of actually in spirit of the week of 420 that this video is being uploaded. But yeah, that's the king. And now that we've talked about the king, let's talk about how to win the game. Like, you've seen how all the pieces move. You've been able to identify the board and how the pieces move and the different properties of the pieces. But how do you actually win the game? I'll give you the answer to that. The object of the game of chess is to capture the enemy king. But you don't actually do that. Let me explain. First, I will need to show you something called check. So, actually, let's do this. Let's say that these are the first moves of the game, and that in this position, well, actually, let's say here and here. Let's say in this position, white played this move. And you heard that funky sound that you heard before in the video because on this square, the bishop now sees the king, which means that if black does not move the king, the bishop will capture the king and white will win. But the rules of chess dictate, actually, that black has to respond to the check. They have to get out of the check. And if they can't get out of the check, they lose. And that's called checkmate. And actually, let's do this just to demonstrate all the three ways. So there are three ways for a player to get out of check. The first way, and probably the most obvious way, is to just move the king out of the attack. The king on this square is no longer able to be captured by the bishop, and black will not lose the game. The second way to prevent a check is to get in the way of the attacking piece. Remember how I said that once you capture a piece, you can't move through it. So the king is protected by the bishop, and this is no longer check. But the third way to get out of check is to simply capture the checking piece. Now the king is obviously no longer attacked. But what happens when you can't do either of those methods? What happens when your king is just stuck being attacked? like this. This, folks, is what is called checkmate. This term has been introduced into the popular lexicon. Like, you say checkmate when you like own someone in an argument or something. But its origin was in the game of chess. And this is it. Checkmate is when the king is in check and it cannot use any of the three methods to get out of it. The king cannot move anywhere because here is also controlled by the queen, and it cannot move on top of its own pieces. You cannot block this check because the knight cannot go to any square in front of it, and you cannot capture the queen. So this is checkmate, and black wins. This is actually called the fool's mate because it's actually the earliest possible in a game of chess that an opponent can be checkmated. It's impossible to checkmate someone in one move, but this is the only way you can do it in two moves. And it's just a really easy way to demonstrate the concept of checkmate. That is the goal of the game. The goal of chess is to attack the opponent's king with the idea of getting checkmate. So that might look something like this. Like you go queen here, and then you go bishop here. Notice that the queen and the bishop eye that square. And let's say black plays this move. And this is a very easy way to demonstrate the difference between check and checkmate, because if white played bishop takes, then the king would be able to move out of the check, so it's not checkmate. But if the queen instead captured, the king can't move here. The king cannot take the queen because it is protected by the bishop, and there is no piece that can get in the way of the check. So this is checkmate, and white wins. This is called the scholar's mate. This is a way that a lot of beginners get checkmated. So here I am warning you against the scholar's mate. But if you fall victim to it, you don't need to worry. It happens to everyone. So that is how you win the game. That is your goal. But before we end the video, I think we need to talk about some special moves. Now don't be intimidated. That sounds way more intimidating than it actually is. Special moves are just moves that aren't covered in like the basic move set of the pieces in chess, but are actually important in how the game is played. So the first special move in chess is with the king and the rook. So let's say, for instance, that we played this opening. Pawn up 2 squares, pawn up 2 squares. Remember at near the beginning, I said that this is the widely accepted best first move for each side. Knight here, knight there, bishop there, bishop there. This is a very popular opening called the Giuoco Piano game. And it is a perfect opportunity for me to demonstrate the first special move. So if your king and your rook have no pieces in between them, and both of them haven't moved in the game so far, and also if the king would not be in check in moving over here. Now, I'll show you what that means. It's called castling, and it looks like this. It's the only way that you can move two pieces at the same time. All right, and something I think I should mention as well, like this is really important. It kind of was brought to my mind after I described how castling works, is now that we've learned how the pieces move, like how do you talk about chess moves? Like you hear these chess grandmasters all the time being going like, oh, knight to e5 is such a good move because then there's knight to f7 and it's not guarded by the h8 rook or something like this. And it's really simple when you get down to it. It's really that each square has a name, which is a combination between its row and its column. So the columns go this is from white's perspective. The columns go from left to right, A to H, and the rows go from top to bottom, 1 to 8. And from black's perspective, it goes from left to right, H to A, and from bottom to top, 8 to 1. And each square is named by its combination of row and column. So these moves that I showed you at the beginning of the video, this is pawn to e4, because this is the e row and the e column and the 4 row. So it's pawn to e4, and black plays pawn to e5 because it's 5e, e5. So these that's like the coordinates. Those they're called coordinates. It's how you talk about chess moves. It's how you talk about chess squares. So if you hear people talking like that, just know that they're only referring to like the squares on the board. It's nothing too complicated. But the idea is to get the king to safety and sort of give it a little bunker to hunker down in. But the idea is that if your king, because your king moves over here, right? Like just let's break it down. The king moves from e1 to g1, and the rook moves from h1 to f1. If the king would be in check in either of these two squares, you cannot castle. So let's say it looked a little bit different. Like white plays this move, but then we get like the same idea. Then white cannot castle because the bishop controls g1, which is the square that the king would end up on. So that is castling, but it can also happen on the other side of the board. For instance, it happens very often in what's called the Sicilian defense. You don't need to worry about the intricacies of the opening yet, but this is called the dragon variation of the Sicilian defense, and white's idea is to castle queenside, and we'll see how that works. Actually, we'll see how both castling works in this opening. So the king for black, no pieces in between it, is not in check. Both of these pieces haven't moved. So the king moves over 2 squares and the rook moves to the other side of it. But you can also castle this way. And notice the king and the rook are 1 square further apart from each other. So while the king moves from e1 to c1, the rook jumps it to the side 3 squares. And that is called queenside castling. Because the queen starts off on this square, right? So this side of the board, the left side of the board, from white's perspective, is called the queen side, and the right side is called the king side. And those are the 2 different kinds of castling. Now we will talk about the next special move. The next special move is very important. It's actually a huge part of what you're trying to do in a game of chess, and it is called promotion. So what happens, like I said way earlier, like a pawn cannot move backwards. So what happens if theoretically a pawn makes it to the other side of the board? What happens if this happens? Will the pawn just sit there like an idiot? Will he go into chess retirement? No! This is where I can introduce the second special move called promotion. And this is what I like to sort of conceptualize as the pawn achieving its lifelong dream of turning into a beautiful queen, or a regal bishop, or a powerful rook, or a tricky knight. Because when a queen makes it to, or when a pawn makes it to the other side of the board, when a white pawn makes it to the 8th row, or when a black pawn makes it to the 1st row, it can turn into any one of these pieces, and that is called pawn promotion. And it is the second special move in chess. Now, why is this important, you may ask? It's important because the queen and all those other pieces are more valuable than the pawns, and they are able to do more things than the pawns. So let me just set up a theoretical position here. Like, let's say here, here, and then black has like this and this. This is our position here. And white has this 1 pawn. So white is going to be trying to promote that 1 pawn, and black is going to be trying to stop that 1 pawn. So it's white's move. So they go here. Wait, why can't this pawn go forward? Okay, the pawn can go forward. So white will move the king here. And let's say here and check. And let's just say black doesn't take this, because you can take it. The knight would be protected by the king, so the king cannot take. Let's say black moves over here for some reason. Then you push here and promote. I mean, in this case, there's this, which wins the queen because you check the king and attack the queen at the same time, but we'll cover that more in future videos. But the point is that white is better if they make the queen here because the queen is more powerful than the pawn. So black is going to take the pawn, and the game would end in a draw because it would just be knight and king versus king, which is not enough material to checkmate the opponent. All right, now that we've covered the practical applications of promotion, we can talk about my favorite special move and Chess Internet's favorite special move called en passant. Now, this is a move that a lot of beginners don't even know about. I'm absolutely shocked. Like, even at my rating, I'm like 1,500, and there are still people who, after I play this move, tell me that I'm hacking the game or something. And you will see, I am going to give you the top secret knowledge of the legendary move en passant here. So get ready. So, if a pawn moves forward 2 squares from its starting square, like we discussed way ago, and the square that it lands on places it directly next to an enemy pawn, the enemy pawn can capture this pawn. And you may be like, what? That's not how pawns work at all. I thought they could only capture like this because they're not like the other pawns. Well, will I tell you, they're even more not like the other pieces. I think I said not like the other pawns. I meant not like the other pieces. They're even more not like the other pieces because they can capture this pawn by doing this. And that is called en passant. It is when a pawn moves 2 squares, lands next to an enemy pawn, and the enemy pawn can capture it by going diagonally behind it. So think of it like there is actually a pawn here, and this pawn is taking it, but instead the pawn is here, and you can still take it. And a funny thing about en passant is that you can't do it after the first move. You see that you can't play this anymore. It can only happen the move after the pawn goes here. So it doesn't really show up that much because there's honestly not a lot of instances where you would have pawns like this. But it is a way that you could like trick your opponent. Like I've had so many people be like, "What? I thought pawns captured like this. You're hacking the game." So if one of your opponents gets confused about you playing en passant in a game, just make sure you let him know who taught it to you. I mean, or don't. I'm not your parent. Like I don't need to tell you what to do. All right, now that you are armed with all of that knowledge, I have to say, you are almost ready to play your first game of chess. And as they say, knowing is half the battle. But in the next video, I will actually discuss, using all of these things that we have learned in this video, I will discuss how you combine them to create a strategy to win the game. And with that, folks, I am the amazing Haley, the gender fluid chess teacher, and I will be back at you tomorrow with an intermediate level recap video, my quest to 1600, and I'll be back at you next Saturday with Fundamentals of Chess episode 2. See ya!